Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 2021 Legacies and Lunch, a program of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, the Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries and bookstore at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Tuesday through Friday from 10 to 5, and we will be open Saturday, August 14th and Saturday, August 28th from noon to 4 for this month's bonus Saturdays. Please go to robertslibrary.org for all the specifics before you plan your visit. This program is being live streamed to YouTube. It actually worked this month and will be available to view on the Cowles YouTube channel immediately following the program. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session, so please type your questions in the chat box in Zoom. And now to today's program. This month, we have Kelly Houston Jones to talk about her new book, A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas. Kelly Houston Jones is an assistant professor of history at Arkansas Tech University. A native of Conway County, she received her PhD from the University of Arkansas in 2014. Her work can be found in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly and Agricultural History, as well as several edited volumes such as Bullets and Fire, Lynching and Authority in Arkansas, which was edited by our very own Guy Lancaster. I do want to mention before we get started that Kelly will also be on a panel for our book fest, for the Six Bridges Book Fest in October. So look for more information about that as well. So please, everybody, give a warm welcome to Kelly Houston Jones.
There I am.
Hey,
everybody. Thanks so much for joining us in this virtual world right now. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to spend perhaps your lunch hour or a later time with me and this new book, A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas. It is published by University of Georgia Press. One misconception I'm running into lately is that people assume that it's with University of Arkansas Press, another great press, but you will have to go to the ugapress.org website to order it rather than UA Press website. I have got good news for everybody. We've got a 30% discount on the book and free shipping if you use the code that I'm pretty sure you guys can see on the screen here. The code is 08weary21. And I think it'll be open actually for another couple of days. So you can hop on to ugapress.org and find the book and then use that code. The program that they use is called Red Leaf or something Leaf. And so it's a little clunky. I'm going to, go ahead and warn you guys that it'll make you sort of make some sort of account and, it'll be several clicks before you can get in there. But hey, that 30% off with free shipping, you can't beat it. All right. And we can talk about that a little bit more if you guys have questions about how to get the book and where to get the book when we're finished. What I want to do today is hit some of the major themes and points of the book and highlight some of the stories within so that you can get a sense of what the book's trying to do, what in there might be new from other things that you've read about slavery in Arkansas, how it might be different from Negro slavery in Arkansas, published in 1958 by Orville Taylor. And sort of like hit sort of the things that I think are most important about this story, give you some anecdotes from people who lived this out, and then we'll have some time for questions. And one of the things that I promised was carving out some time to talk about this specific difficulty with researching the lives of enslaved people. It's a lot of detective work, and so we can talk about that as well. I think the first thing to point out when it comes to themes about the history of slavery in Arkansas is that it's everywhere. It's pretty easy to convince folks that slavery was an important factor in the development of Arkansas in the southeast, or just the south, southern part of the state. But one thing that not everybody's always aware of is how this is a force that influenced Arkansas's settlement, the settlement of white Southerners to Arkansas all over the state, in every single nook and cranny of what's going to be called Arkansas. Slaveholders are the ones who get the best land, who achieve political power and sort of construct what Arkansas is going to mean. Okay. So one of the things that the book tries to do is give you a sense that the construction of the concept of Arkansas as a place by 19th century Americans relies on the growth of chattel slavery there. So Arkansas's political boundaries are shaped, the actual borders, right, are shaped by the history of slavery. The landscape itself has, bears the fingerprint of the history of slavery there. So slavery, the practice of slavery, and of course the lives of enslaved people defined Arkansas's ground in the lowlands, in the upcountry, east, west, north, south, all parts of Arkansas. Arkansas's economy, as you know, early on is predominantly agricultural, and that's going to enrich the prominent leaders of the state. And of course, that is happening on the backs of enslaved people forced to work that land. So it's everywhere in terms of all parts of the state, and it's everywhere in terms of the power, okay, that people have in the state of Arkansas. The folks who run things in Arkansas are slaveholders. And one example that I want to take advantage of the moment to share is Jacob Wolf. So like I said, it's easy if I come in here and say, hey, Chico County planters, they're running things. But I think other parts of the state, that story is less well known. And so that's part of what some of the lifting that the book is trying to do. So I've got here an image of the Jacob Wolf house. Okay, Jacob Wolf, his cabin is up in what's now Baxter County. It was then Izard County. And so this is the confluence of the White and North Fork rivers. This cabin is a historic site that you can go visit today. And one thing that I wish we did better around here was sort of emphasizing how enslaved people built the Jacob Wolf house, that cabin. It was an important place for the discussion of early Arkansas politics, the sort of shaping of the political economy of Arkansas, and enslaved people built the site. Enslaved people facilitated the sort of hub that is created there. Jacob Wolf probably brought enslaved people with him when he got to his spot in north central Arkansas. He had 76 acres by 1829. 10 years later, there are for sure at least 4 enslaved people who live on that site. And Wolf by then had expanded to more than 250 acres. By 1850, the enslaved people at Wolf's Place numbered at least 12, doubling by 1860, and they resided in 3 cabins on the site. And so, like I said, the Jacob Wolf house, as it's interpreted, really commonly, it's a trading post, it's a crossroads, it's a political center. Enslaved people witnessed and facilitated all of this, okay, with their labor. People are coming and going, they're exchanging political ideas, they're settling appointments, settling contracts, they're delivering speeches, and enslaved people are there. And so they know what's happening in early Arkansas. They're being forced to facilitate with their labor and their service, right? One thing that I don't see mentioned that often about Jacob Wolf when you see sort of social media posts or whatever about the house is that he chaired a meeting, and I think it was at the house in 1850, where a meeting that's arguing for, quote, Southern rights, meaning slaveholders' rights. And Wolfe was sort of a ringleader of like this group, and he advocated that Arkansas participate in this famous Nashville Convention to argue for the, quote, sacred rights to slave labor. So this is a site that it's a cool, interesting site for early 19th century Arkansas. You can envision all of the goods and services being traded there. You can kind of get a sense of this early, what people will think of as sort of pioneer Arkansas, but it's also a early site of the entrenchment of slavery in Arkansas. And so those things aren't separated, those things come together. And so he's not an outlier. You know, in 1839, enslaved people actually made up 28%. That's over a quarter of Izard County's taxable wealth, and nearly 40% of it in 1843. And this comes from me number crunching, you know, different taxpayers, you know, at the time. 10 years later, it's going to shrink because more people are coming in with different types of assets. But it'll still be over a quarter of the wealth, the taxable wealth of Izard County is held in enslaved people. And so this is, again, it's all over the state, parts of the state that are often interpreted as sort of Ozark Hill country, sort of detached, right, from the plantation complex. They're manifesting the power of slavery in different ways. I also want to bring up William Woodruff, celebrated, okay, his early editor of the Arkansas Gazette when we hit 2019 anniversary, right, of Arkansas's establishment as a standalone territory. A lot of ink spilled on Woodruff and his role in that period of Arkansas's history. I would like to point out that, like a lot of these other leaders, William Woodruff is an enslaver. He wheels and deals, he buys and sells enslaved people. He's a land speculator, which is an early way for slaveholders in Arkansas to convert their wealth. A lot of times they'll buy up the cheap land early on and sell it, convert that into property in enslaved people, to put it crudely, and sort of build up their little empires that way. William Woodruff is one of those. The book also gives you the stories of similar folks. Nimrod Menifee does the same thing. If you've ever been to the Drennan Scott House in Fort Smith, John Drennan does the same thing. So they'll early on, they're land speculators turned slave wheelers and dealers, right? And then on to planters and some of the other things, that the other business pursuits that they get themselves into. So the early records, the early legal records of Arkansas reveal William Woodruff right in there in all of these legal disputes where enslaved people aren't where they're supposed to be for different reasons. And in one particular dispute, there was a man named Opolis, and for short in the record, they're often calling him Op with two O-P-P, two P's. And he wasn't where he was supposed to be. He was technically owned by a man whose last name was Bentley, but he wasn't there. Bentley sued William Woodruff because Bentley says Woodruff sort of captured him and kept him and used his labor for his own benefit. It turned out that William Woodruff and Chester Ashley had sort of come across this guy Op and rented him out to yet another Little Rock family. And so even one enslaved person has such value for these guys and ladies in this economy that they'll fight tooth and nail to make sure that enslaved people are benefiting who they're supposed to. And one of the things that's interesting about this early history, and I'll kind of move to this here in a minute, is that enslaved people are just at every turn sort of foiling whites' plans for sort of order over chaos, for production over loss. And so we'll see that tension here in a minute. I'll also point out that William Woodruff, whenever Southeastern planters sort of freak out during the Civil War, they're afraid that enslaved people will run off to the Union Army. They at least one guy sends a group of enslaved people up to Little Rock to sort of keep them out of freedom's reach, and William Woodruff puts them to work, right? So he's constantly involved in all of this, an aspect of the history that you don't always get, especially when we had that anniversary in 2019. I was disappointed. I wanted to see more of that when we did that. Okay, so last guy to kind of profile here, Peter Van Winkle of Van Winkle's Mill in Northwest Arkansas gives us a kind of a glimpse into the early entrenchment and continuing, right, like benefit for slaveholders of chattel slavery in a part of the state that's not really known for like cotton plantations, right? So you've got several enslaved people who lived on this creek close to the White River, and they are providing significant labor in building Northwest Arkansas via Van Winkle's mill. Peter Van Winkle, he's from New York. He began amassing land in Washington, Benton, Carroll County by the 1840s. And by 1850, he's got sort of a complex that he's established on the North Fork of the Little Clifty Creek there, War Eagle Township. By 1860, 13 enslaved people lived and worked at Van Winkle's complex, including 5 adult men, 2 adult women, and that number is going to grow to at least 18 by 1861. And that is an unusually high number of enslaved people in one place for Northwest Arkansas. What are they doing? There's a sawmill there at Van Winkle's. I mean, they're gardening. He's kind of got his hands in a lot of different things. But Van Winkle's operation, where he's making his money, is in lumber. And so he builds roads. He builds roads, meaning the labor that he uses, right? Builds roads that make it easy, relatively, right, for the 19th century to have access to Fayetteville, what was then Shiloh, now, you know, Springdale, Huntsville, Bentonville. And so with that relatively easy transportation, he's sending lumber from his mill out to these budding towns in Northwest Arkansas. And of course, he's using enslaved labor at those mills to do that. And so the history of slavery in Arkansas and the way that people use that labor to enrich themselves and to develop, okay, I'm using the air quotes, right, a certain type of society, it's all over the state, but it doesn't always look the same, right? And so to say that the cotton plantation complex doesn't reach and doesn't really make sense, right, agriculturally, economically, for Northwest Arkansas, is not to say that slavery isn't absolutely central to the economy and the society and the politics there, right? So it's all over. So I think I've made that point decently enough for you guys. Let me move to this topic of tension. And this is really kind of the main thing that the book is trying to do. What is this ground that's marked off and called Arkansas supposed to be? What is it supposed to do? What is its future? Okay, and so of course, not everybody has the same idea of what the answers to those questions are. This book deals a lot in the back and forth between enslavers, right, whites who have a certain idea of Arkansas as an agricultural haven where settlers can make good, create their own sense of what's orderly, what's civilized, what's productive. That tension, you know, that vision for Arkansas versus what enslaved people, right, or how they're trying to make sense of their surroundings. So whites go through a lot of trouble to create Arkansas in the vision of really what they know in the older parts of the South. They move Native Americans off of Arkansas's acreage so that they can move enslaved people onto Arkansas's acreage. This is going to create, this is part of what in their mind creates civilization, you know, production, progress. So it's not just the presence of enslaved people, but it's also, of course, the productive labor of Black enslaved people that's part of what makes whites' sense of civilization and order, you know, out of what they imagine is the wild chaos, okay, of Arkansas's landscape. So enslaved people are supposed to create this, but they're not supposed to be partakers of it. So in whites' designs for Arkansas's acreage, they see a kingdom of cotton, of corn, of livestock production, and these are sort of get into the details of that in the book. But enslaved people are supposed to be sort of tools in creating that, but not necessarily actual actors of their own volition and sort of partakers of like the bounty of that. And so one of the things, and not to get like too much into the weeds here, you guys may not be this interested in sort of some of the theory of this, but there's one environmental scholar who says that there's one of the sort of essential problems, questions, issues when it comes to the history of slavery is so if enslaved people are forced onto this land and they're really sort of alienated from it in the ideal of what's created by whites, if they're held at arm's length from what that land is supposed to really be doing, then how do they see that acreage? Do they think of themselves as farmers, even though it's a coerced farming? Do they think of themselves as, pioneers, right? Do they think of themselves as Arkansans? And so one of the things I try to interrogate for us in the book is, how do enslaved people sort of like make sense of this? And so they see in the sort of chaos that whites are trying to fix, of Arkansas, all the forests, the swamps, all of this stuff that needs drained, it needs cleared, it needs cultivated. For enslaved people, what they're looking around and seeing is an escape. It's an escape. It's an opportunity to get out from under the labor regime, if only, temporarily. And so when enslaved people then look at the cotton field, the cornfield, whites view that as the source of bounty, civilization, production, the prosperity of their family, and sort of passing that on to their children. Enslaved people see the source of all of the chaos in their lives, right? Like that cash crop is the thing that's creating everything that's precarious, for enslaved people. So what I'm trying to get out here is that Arkansans are looking at the same surroundings, in different ways. And so that tension is a theme, throughout this book. The first place where that really shows itself is in an early chapter called The Morass, and it's about Arkansas territory, like moving into statehood, early statehood. And I'm using the term morass similarly to the way historian Joshua Rothman uses it. He wrote a really great book called Flush Times and Fever Dreams. And he talks about Arkansas territory. He's really talking specifically about this eastern chunk of the territory, but I'm kind of like widening it for my analysis. But this, swampy area of East Arkansas, it's harboring all manner of people who are up to no good, if you're thinking of the sort of ideal, right, for white 19th century Southern society. Runaway slaves, people who are running away from debts, people who wait and rob steamboats. There's a lot of sort of dangerous and chaotic stuff going on in the swamps of Eastern Arkansas as white Southerners see it. And so this is the kind of thing that's got early white settlers very nervous. You can see in the newspaper clippings, newspaper editors on the east side of the Mississippi, sort of further into the more settled part of the South, they talk about Arkansas as, quote, infested, with thieves, outcasts, describing them as, quote, skulking, around, their detection almost impossible, retreating into, quote, impervious cane brakes. And so it is true that white and Black Americans both thought of the land west of the Mississippi River as really like the end of the civilized world, but when forced out there, right, speculators think of it as a place that's going to have this potential for enrichment, and enslaved people who find themselves there notice that same landscape provides the means for their resistance. So I try not to make too much of that and sort of make it sound like the woods, the canebrake, the swamps of Arkansas are just sort of an unqualified haven for enslaved people, because that's not true. But what I want readers to understand is that the relatively sparsely populated nature of the state, the fact that it's got this reputation for lawlessness, a lot of people are not, going to move there. Its newness, as a territory and then state. Those are things that make Arkansas a really attractive place for enslavers to bring enslaved people. it also provides the means for enslaved people to resist. So there's this tension, there's this kind of twofold thing that's going on. And the early part of the book, in the morass, I'm talking about that, specifically Arkansas Territory period and early statehood, but really it's a metaphor for this whole history of slavery in Arkansas. This battle between what whites think of as order over chaos, right, versus what enslaved people think of as relief versus bondage. And so the major theme that I'm driving in the book is that, like enslaved people elsewhere, those in Arkansas, they're doing their best to survive. They're doing this via family, society, culture, all of these things that we see all over the place in this history across the country. But when you look at Arkansas, you're also really struck by enslaved people's use of Arkansas's vast forests. I'm calling it uncultivated zones in the book, the woods, the river bottoms, the cane breaks, these places where the fields can't reach, okay, and the roads don't reach. If you look at the history of slavery in Arkansas and ask, like, is there a thing? I get asked this a lot. Well, what's the deal with slavery in Arkansas? What is, is it unique? And it's not so much that this isn't happening at some level in other parts of the South as well. It's that if you look at the history of slavery and its resistance in Arkansas, you are bowled over by the frequency with which enslaved people are using this relatively wild, okay, in the view of 19th century white and Black Americans, to resist, to escape, and often temporarily. And so I opened the book with the story of a man named Reuben Johnson, who really wants to learn how to read. And he finds that even hiding in the quarters is not going to be enough concealment, not only from whites, but from other enslaved people who might, rat him out for their own benefit. And so he hides in the woods at night to, spoiler alert, I guess, he hides in the woods to read. And he'll take like a page at a time, into the woods and sort of, and hide it. And so the woods become his classroom. The woods become a means to an end for him. It's a safe place for that. And so throughout the book, I then explore how different folks use these places beyond the fields and the houses and the roads, beyond those public spaces, to resist and really just cope with their bondage. One important example is religion. There's a lot of secretly held religious activity going on in the woods, okay, in the brush, often at night after whites go to sleep. And of course, the practice of attending church services with whites is pretty commonplace. The practice of whites preaching to enslaved people in their own quarters or in the yard or whatever is pretty commonplace. But the sources show us that enslaved people who want to pray without inhibitions about what they're praying for, enslaved people who are practicing a subversive Christianity that emphasizes freedom, right? It's safer to do that away from whites' eyes and ears. That's the sort of most obvious thing that we can see here. Now, one thing that I find that people don't always, know about is that many bondspeople weren't allowed to take part in religious services or open, praying at all on the place, that they're held. And so it may be that the only time that they get to do any praying or singing would be, in the woods at night after whites, have gone to bed. And so there's different levels, okay, of sort of what these people are up against. But a consistent thing we find is that getting away from white spaces, from spaces of production, getting out into the woods and in the swamps can help cultivate enslaved people's own sense of, their religious life. It gives them that breathing room. And so what I'm getting at here is, so those spaces then, they're not chaotic wilderness to the people who are making use of them in these ways. One scholar used the term sanctified, or I'm sorry, re-sanctified, that enslaved people are creating sacred places out of zones that are sort of like throwaway, okay, for whites who don't see them as, sort of productive or, useful or civilized. They're also using the woods and swamps to gather with friends. They're meeting, of course, they're praying and singing. It may be a place to meet up with a sweetheart. Some courting, right? These are also the places that facilitate enslaved people's information networks. If you've got information about, and this is really shows itself in the coming of the Civil War, who is this Lincoln guy? What does this thing mean? Like, what's happening? Where are the troops? What's sort of what's going on in the outside world, and like how much of it is getting close to here. People are finding that out, not by going down the road to the next plantation, but by going the back way, as one guy put it in the WPA ex-slave interviews. They are informing each other of what they find out by these networks that the natural landscape actually facilitates for them. So I want to move to really sort of what's showtime for it. It's really when this heats up, this tension between, what whites think, where whites think enslaved people should be, what they should be doing, and sort of what the woods and brushy and swampy places mean versus those productive spaces on the farm and plantation. During the war, a lot of this gets flipped, okay? And I guess the first thing to say is that, of course, slavery is the reason that the war happens. And of course, folks who are slave holders are going to try really desperately, okay, to keep this institution alive as long as they can, okay, for obvious reasons. I do want to roll out a Henry Rector quote, though, who was governor earlier on. And he said that without slavery, Arkansas's fertile fields are deserts, and her people penniless and impoverished. So slavery equals prosperity, equals production, equals civilization, right? To get rid of slavery is to wipe all of that away. And this is how white Arkansans view this, and so they are reluctant to let it go. And I'm going to show you some of the sort of creative things they do to try to keep it going. One U.S. officer wrote from Helena at the end of 1863, "It is said that the state of Arkansas is ready to come back into the Union. It is not true. Every slaveholder sticks to the institution as his only hope for fortune, respectability, and means of living. The non-slaveholders are afraid of Negro equality and feel as savage a hostility to the race as animals that by nature devour each other." So this is the climate, okay? What we find during the war is that in order to keep hold of that profit, to protect it, enslavers will now hide bondspeople in the same forests, swamps, and cane brakes that they used to be really exasperated to find them. So now instead of enslaved people hiding there, right, you've got whites running them into those places, keeping them there to try to keep them out of freedom's reach. So for example, if a planter finds out that the U.S. Army is getting close, they will often hide enslaved people in the woods nearby so that they can't get a hold of them. And you might be wondering, why would enslaved people go along with this, right? Like, here's their chance. Sometimes they do because they're also scared. Everybody's scared during the war. And so I've got a quotation here from a guy named Solomon Lambert, and he's remembering this experience. And he says, "He hid the slaves in the bottoms. We carried provisions, and they sent more along. We stayed 2 or 3 days or a week when they heard a regiment, meaning a Union regiment, coming through. We didn't care if they hit us. We heard the guns. We didn't want to go down there." And so for a lot of these people, going along with it and hiding in the woods seems like a way to stay out of the chaos, right? They don't always know sort of what opportunities are available to them. And so now you've got slaveholders making trails into the woods and swamps to provision enslaved people that they have hidden there, rather than following trails to discover, runaways, which is the way it had been for, all of these years up to that point. So I've got an example here of this tension during the war from the Deputy Plantation, and this is from Chico County, Arkansas. This is southeast Arkansas, in the deep, this is sort of thick cotton plantation district. And James Pine was what you call the driver at this plantation, meaning he's held in slavery. He's not free. He's not a free overseer, but he's placed in a sort of relatively sort of leadership, kind of role on the plantation. And he says, I'm going to quote him, "The rebels tried to press some hands from Deputy," meaning the planter, "to work on Fort Pillow up the river. But Deputy had us colored men posted to give notice when the pressers were coming, so we could get back in the woods and run the horses and mules into the cane." So what we've got here is a slaveholder hiding enslaved people, not from Union forces, but from Confederate forces, because again, it's profit, it's continuing, it's protecting the benefit, right, of holding enslaved people. This guy didn't want the enslaved people that he's benefiting from to go off and build, earthworks or do whatever, right? Dig ditches, whatever, the Confederates officials wanted, whatever labor it is that they're trying to get them to do. And so again, the theme, hiding in the woods, with the sanction, right, and actually, at the mandate of the slaveholder. So really, it's now these things, everything seems a little bit flip-flopped. Now, Joseph Deputy is a little bit different, though. He was a Unionist. He's from Indiana. He figures out that slavery is going to end eventually. And so he's going to what he's trying to do is keep enslaved people on the place with him for as long as possible, in the meantime. And it can be difficult to understand the motivations of the enslaved people there. Some of them run off, but some of them stick around. And those who do are probably reckoning that they can achieve, a decent arrangement with the Deputy as free laborers when the war is over, if they stick around and sort of just do, what he's asking for the meantime. Running from his plantation was risky because hiding in the woods and swamps are also guerrilla fighters, right? And people who, frankly, don't really have much of allegiance to anybody. They're sort of just using the upheaval of the war just to sort of take advantage for their own benefit. So it's a dangerous, a risky thing to do. And so, as one of them says, it was dangerous to try to leave because, quote, "there might be rebels in the woods. They were always hanging about bushwhacking." So there's a lot of danger to be had there. So a lot of these folks are going to stick around on the Deputy Plantation. They're avoiding Confederate impressment. They're avoiding guerrillas. And then all bets are off because Joseph Deputy died. So now the enslaved people down here close to, kind of outside Helena, Arkansas, and this plantation, they know that the Federals are in town. The Confederates are in the woods and all kinds of other, guerrillas and people with, you don't even know what their motivations are. And so they're not sure, what to do. One woman from the Deputy Plantation said, "The men were so bad, the women had to keep out of the way. If they hadn't, they would not have been worth 2 bits." So you're kind of getting the sense that, there's a gendered aspect, okay, to this sort of power vacuum as well. So the overseer on Deputy's plantation, he's trying to keep it running for a while, but he ends up spending more and more time in the woods with Confederate guerrillas. One of the enslaved people there told it this way, quote, he would go off to the bushwhackers sometimes and stay a few days and then come back. So eventually, most of the enslaved men and women there and the overseer had left. But one enslaved man named Alec Castile didn't. He decides he's going to take up residence in the empty house, the planter's home. And this was too bold, I guess, for the Confederate guerrillas who were lurking in the woods, surrounding this. They had been watching what was going on. And once they figured out that one of these Black men had moved with his son into the main house and tried to keep farming and just sort of try to keep things together for himself and his own safety, they came for him. And here's how he says it, quote, I moved up in his house and tried to stay there, but the rebels went for me there one night. And so finally he ends up just going to Helena, to Union lines. And so I think the deputy plantation kind of, for us, can be a bit of a metaphor on how things are so chaotic in so many ways because of the war. But everything comes with higher stakes. The choices on whether to stick around on the plantation or to run off into the woods, right? The stakes are higher than ever before. And the usual assumption that if you run away from slavery, you may be the only type of person, in the woods, that doesn't hold anymore, right? The woods and the swamps of Arkansas, vast amounts of them across the state, are just teeming with all kinds of people hiding for all kinds of reasons. And of course, the guerrilla war in Arkansas, as other scholars have shown, is really a central part of how that conflict plays out here. And I think I'll probably leave it there and ask you guys if you have any questions, especially relating to what I promised you guys, which was a willingness to talk about, what kind of sources can you use, like what the difficulty, of patching together the lives of these folks who are so often very little documented.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat right now, and I encourage people to put additional questions because I'm interested in kind of the source material that you used. I was really excited. I'm looking at my notes because I was making notes like I was in a class or something. So I really liked those early comments that you talked about. Slavery was everywhere in Arkansas. I mean, for so long, it has been, that there was this divide down the state and, slavery was only in the southern half. And I love that you took that on because I think it's so important. But Don Bragg would like to know, can you speak to the forest as foodways and sources of medicine, fiber, etc.? And if you can't, we know somebody else who can. And she's actually on this talk, but
oh, nice.
Yeah.
I have got I'm so glad that I got that question. And in fact, if it's not too dorky, let me show you guys what the table of contents looks like here. So you can kind of get a sense of the different topics because I just touched on some things. Can you guys see my table of contents?
A little bit, yes.
I always like to do that when I'm looking for books online to kind of see what different kinds of topics are covered. And so one of the chapters that I have is called The Material of Survival. And it's all about how enslaved people kind of make use of what they can, whether it's from the quote natural world, right, surrounding them, or whether it's like right there in the house, to create as much comfort, relief, right, community as they can. And so that is one of the topics that I talk about in the book, is the fact that enslaved people will often harvest from the forests and prairies around them different we might say like sort of natural remedies, right, to take care of ailments that they have. A lot of different sort of barks and leaves that you can use to ease pain or reduce inflammation. One sort of mini point that I try to make in the book is that it's not quite as simple as sort of whites have the kind of formal science-y kind of medicine, and then enslaved people have the the folk natural, from the forest medicine. It's really a blend. White Southerners are also using those same remedies. Some of them have, they pause and they get nervous when it starts to look like what scholars call conjure, conjure. If the folk remedy has this sort of, looks like it has sort of like a spiritual element to it as well, then that's where whites might ban it, and so maybe enslaved people have to use it secretly or claim they're doing something else, or whatever. But what the scholarship shows us is that for African American Southerners and, beyond, but the South is what I know, there isn't a real break between the spiritual and the health realms, okay, in this era, okay? You can't really disentangle their ideas about community and spirituality from their ideas about health and healing. And so one item, one poultice, okay, it might have its specific uses for inflammation, which is like, that's the most common thing, that they're doing. So pain and redness and whatever, cuts, and stuff. But it's also who's putting it on, what's the context for that use. And so often you can find that people, they see the remedy as a sort of spiritual and medical sort of relief. And I'm using a term in the book that Charla Fett, who's really the expert on this, uses, and that is that they have a relational view of health and medicine. So it's always got these sort of threads on, community and spirituality, and, and sort of linking everybody, together. And so that's where they butt heads. In food as well, right? So nuts is a huge one. It depends on the time of year, right? The fishing, I've got some stuff in the book on, hunting to supplement the diet and all of this, as well. So that bounty that's around them, they make use of it. Sometimes with the sanction of whites, and sometimes in secret, depending on what they're doing and why.
Right. Well, and I want to mention that while you were talking and I was off camera, I ordered my copy of the book. The code worked. And actually, the University of Georgia Press remembered, I had forgotten, but they remembered that I had already established an account with them because I'd ordered a book a year ago from them.
Right.
So it automatically, it was easy. It was
good.
I felt like it was easy. So my copy is coming. Okay, Dee Dee Wallace she says, I'm currently researching slavery in Chico County. Does your book address Chico County specifically?
There is actually quite a bit on Chico County in the book, probably more than my Ozark Studies friends like Becky Howard and Brooks Blevins would like. This is one of the things I tried to do in the book better than I did with the dissertation, is kind of work in not just other parts of the state besides that sort of heavy cotton concentration, but to show how they're, linked to each other. So if you are interested in Chico County, there's a lot. There's probably an imbalance, actually. And if you haven't talked to Tom DeBlack, then you should definitely put him on your list for sure.
And I would recommend Blake Wintry, even though he has made an exodus to Tennessee. There's still knowledge in there. So both of those gentlemen will be able to help you. So Elizabeth Shores, who recently did a program for us on her new book, she says, congratulations on a terrific book, and thanks for putting a spotlight on William Woodruff. I am working on a book about his entire record as an enslaver, with profiles of 8 enslaved persons, including Araminta. I hope did I pronounce that right? One of the enslaved women you mentioned. So your book will be very helpful. However, I have not managed to flesh out Woodruff's extensive land speculation and just how it related to his slave holdings. Is there any chance you will do something more on that?
Well, I thought that I should, but if I find out that someone else is, then I can let it go. So actually, I really like that somebody else is interested in this. I was actually joking, but kind of not, with Patrick Williams and Mike Pierce, like a long time back, and they probably don't remember it, about writing something on Woodruff the Slaver and calling it Printer's Devil. little editorial
Like
humor.
that. Like that.
So, but you know what? She should email me and let me, there's my, oh wait, no, it isn't. I think it's on one of these other slides. I should have put this back up so that way if anybody wants to, I do not have, there's my email address. I don't have like direct links on like, okay, well, which plot of land did Woodruff possibly have certain people, laboring on? But I think the easy thing to say is that he's making money off that, and then he's putting it into putting that wealth into enslaved people. So I would say you can sort of set the burden down on trying to link specific acreage, right, with specific enslaved people. It's just, for me, it's enough to know that, like so many of the rest of them, land speculation rolls into slaveholding at these early like trading posts and stuff, rolls into and the cotton and corn farms, and plantations, and then on, right? And so as the economy develops, the role of slavery doesn't go away. It just sort of like, it changes, and it just keeps, it's a snowball effect, really.
Right. So Danielle Butler would like to know, when trying to do research on specific individuals, what were the most non-traditional resources you used? Write this down.
Most kind of, I think I would use the word, I'm going to use the word obscure. I almost said random, but I'm like, maybe it's not random. The most obscure, and by that I mean less well-known source that I have used, is not an easy one to get your hands on, and that was the disallowed bounty claims from USCT soldiers' families after the war. So essentially, if a soldier didn't make it, and then the family could petition, if they even knew about this possibility, right, which not everybody's going to know about, they could petition for the money owed to that soldier when he died. And so what they've got to do to make that case, like say, hey, I'm the one who, this should naturally come to me, I can only make that case if I show how everybody else is dead, right? And so in making that case, I find out, or in making that case, these people end up giving all of this written explanation of where people are from and what they're doing, and sort of what happened to them, right? And so when it comes to individuals and sort of what their stories are, the weirdest, or I guess most unusual, I didn't even know it existed until some guy at the National Archives saw what I was doing with the other USCT records and sent me that way. I would never have known about that record otherwise.
And where are they at the National Archives?
Those are the National Archives in DC. And so what I should probably do is instead tell people about records that they can actually have some hope, of getting their hands on anytime soon and without like a lot of cost. An underused source is the court records, for sure. White people suing each other over all kinds of things. You can find out little tidbits that they didn't intend really to tell, to reveal or explore about enslaved people.
I found that the Southern Claims records were fascinating too, that testimony, because there's lots of little things in there that they slip and say, and it doesn't, it's you're like, oh, you had no idea that 160 years later, somebody was going to go, gotcha. So,
the Southern Claims Commission records. And for people who don't know what that is, after the war was over, the United States set up a system whereby if you had given up property for the sake of U.S. forces during the war, you could make a case to get paid back for that. You had to be loyal, to the United States. And so they spend a lot of their time sort of talking about how loyal they are. And one of the questions that they get is, did you risk your life And so that's why so many of them will say, oh yeah, so-and-so said they were going to kill me because I was a unionist. And it's like, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, you know what I mean? It's it's not hard to believe, but that's why that pattern, is there. And so a lot of times they're making the case of like how they're all like so very unionist. But in the course of doing that, you find out about sort of who was where, what they had. And sometimes it's a Black Arkansan who was loyal and who had some property and lost it to the Union Army, whether it was impressed or whether they, got their receipt, whatever the deal was. And then sometimes it's white Southerners who were loyal to the United States during the war and are able to round up formerly enslaved people who lived there to attest to, okay, yeah, this is how many bushels of corn were on the farm in 1862, or whatever. And so that's another kind of surprising way to find out stories about individuals.
So Mark Christ asks, what are your best sources? And that may be the same answer, but.
Best. I think as far as sources that I am bringing their bounty to the reader who cannot get to the National Archives, I'm going to say best is the pension files, the bounty claims, which there's only a little bit of that here. I think other articles I've written, there's a little bit more of the bounty claim stuff, but I'm starting to get my eyes are sort of crossing on that kind of stuff lately. But the pension files, as far as bringing to readers something that they wouldn't have likely be able to get their hands on, otherwise.
Yeah.
But, the pension files, you grab just a teeny bit of info out of each one. So you have to do a lot of mining just to get even a little bit of information. So I think the court records might be a contender, because although they're not necessarily hard to get your hands on, if you know about them, people don't necessarily know about them. So if you read this book, you're going to get a lot of stories of people living life under slavery in Arkansas that we know their names, we know where they lived, we know something about their life because white people sued each other, right? And so I think the WPA ex-slave interviews, those are people know about those sources. People know about, the census and the tax records that they use to kind of like frame the story. But I think that those court records, again, underused. And I mean, there's a couple that you see cited kind of over and over again, the really wild ones, Abbey Guy and stuff like that, or the Austin versus the state. But some of these other little ones, like the Nimrod Menifee thing, like which is like the opening for this chapter, I think it's chapter like 3. Nimrod Menifee, actually, I'm not going to tell you guys what happens in Nimrod Menifee. It's like a spoiler.
You have to buy the book.
Yeah, I'm just like, I'm like way too happy about what happened to him, but whatever.
So Story Matt Conron says, hi, Kelly. For those of us introducing young scholars, middle and high school students to primary sources about the lives of enslaved people in Arkansas, do you have any favorite sources for those types? Sorry, do you have any favorite sources or types of sources? So for high school students that may not know what a primary source is.
I actually think it's going to sound like a lame, answer because they're so easy to get your hands on. But I actually think that some of the best conversations I've had with young people about history and how we do it and bias, and sort of context for a source can come from the WPA interviews, because there's so many layers to them. They're so complicated and like not in a good way, right? Like you sort of talking to students about, what are the incentives here? You've got an elderly Black Arkansan in the heat of the Depression, and a white person comes to their porch and says, hi, I'm from the government and I want to ask you about slavery. The incentive is to sugarcoat, right? And so we get to talk about, who's actually interviewing them, what kind of, there's clearly some kind of template, for this. We get to talk about how it's not an actual oral history, right? Because oral history standards are record, transcribe, that kind of thing. And so there's just so many things you can talk about with just one or two short interviews. And so I find those to be very useful. And, the questions about sort of secondary ed, but the freshmen in college, I mean, like you can hit the 18 and 20 somethings or whatever with it as well. And it's just an onion with so many layers to talk about. Like, what is history? Like, how do we do it? What counts? What's bias? How do you even use those sources? Can you even really have any hope of finding anything like truth, in a source like that?
Right.
Obviously, I think you can, because I use them like crazy, in this book. So,
well, I think also a lot of us were taught to discount the WPA narratives for some of the reasons you've just said. And I've been going back and looking at them, and I'm looking at them with a different, I guess, with a 2020 or 2021 lens.
right.
And so, yeah, I think there's more there than maybe some people originally thought. So,
yeah, and I think that one of the things about it is this worry that it doesn't line up, right? Like that they've got a foggy memory, or whatever. And actually one of the obvious, things about those interviews is if you're old enough to remember slavery in like 1934, you're real old or you were a kid, right? Yeah. When this happened. And so, what you're remembering as a child, from your childhood, there's just so much to say, with that. But for the purposes I've used them here, sometimes things line up shockingly well, like the who, what, when, where kind of stuff. But more importantly, for the really like human stories that I'm trying to tell here, is the fact that if someone tells you how a particular event made them feel, I think you can trust that, right? Like when someone says, my mom came from Virginia and then this happened to Lynch, and these sort of the truths, right, of these family stories are there. Even if we have to sort of like dig and be really, really careful, with them. So, and that's really like a big difference between me and Orville Taylor, because there's zero attempts to do any of that in that book.
Yes. Someone's asking for the code again. It was on that front slide.
Here we go. It's 08 Weary 21.
So Andrew Mobbs asks, Dr. Jones, you mentioned two enslavers, Woodruff and Ashley. Are these two men the namesakes of the respective Arkansas counties? And then also, to your knowledge, are other Arkansas counties named after enslavers?
I am not really. That's kind of like a Russell Baker question on like what counties, what people are
or
named
a after. Parker Westbrook question.
Right. I would say probably yes. I'm going to say yes. I think it's safe to say yes on those.
Yeah.
But yes, a lot of other places are named with the surnames of the people who are the early sort of movers and shakers in a community. Maybe they've got the first like store or the first like big farm, or, maybe that was where you crossed the river, or whatever these things are. And of course, it just so happens that the people who are creating these places and this wealth and doing this settlement, they're slaveholders.
Yes.
And so then, they're not necessarily getting named because, right, they're slaveholders, but they're getting named because the early people who whites think of are of note, right, notable folks, are people with money. And people with money in the 19th century, or people with money in the antebellum period, are slaveholders in Arkansas and, in the rest of the South. So like when you drive by Menifee, we know who that is.
Yeah.
For just, for example. So all over.
And Andrew, if you go to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas and search for any of the Arkansas county names, then it will tell you most likely who it was named for. And you can probably trace it and figure this out. But yeah, I would say Sevier, Deshay, Crittenden, Randolph. They're all 75, not all of them, but a lot of them. So Guy Lancaster wants to know what your next project is, and he says, just curious.
Okay. So I applied for and got into the Southern Historical Association's second book workshop. And the project that I pitched was that I would get a start on a book on absentee slaveholding. And really what I would call like a portfolio plantation. We think of portfolio plantations, people who invest in the plantation, but they're not involved. Well, they're involved, but they're not there, running it. We think of that as a sort of post-Civil War thing, but there are all kinds of people doing that in the antebellum period. And they're written about, actually quite a bit here and there in the histories, but not as such, not as absentee owned plantations. And so I also, though, have a burning interest in the history of the lynching of enslaved people, not just in Arkansas, but across the South, because again, most, and I would say even most Southern historians would say that lynching of enslaved people was, it almost never happened because of the profit motive, right? Because it's not in your economic sort of interest to let that kind of thing happen. And I'm finding all the time and being emailed by Guy Lancaster all the time with incidences of this happening, not just in Arkansas, but in, other, my Tennessee connections, send me stuff when they run across it. And so I think there's something to be written about the history of the lynching of enslaved people and how the profit incentive does not keep it from happening at all. It means that it happens in a particular way.
I also wonder if some of it was violence towards other family members, so I'm just putting that out there. I'll talk with Guy about that later.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I think, we've got people are giving county names. We've got Washington, we've got Cross.
Mm-hmm.
Ian Beard says it might just be easier to name the ones that weren't named after enslavers. Yes, that's very true. Michael Pierce says the only safe ones would be Lincoln and Grant. Are we sure they're named after that Lincoln and that Grant? So I love all these Legacies and Lunch alumni are on here.
I love it. Y'all, I actually got an email from a law professor at Boston College who is doing a study of place naming and sort of organizing places, towns, villages, whatever you want, settlements, communities in what he calls the Near West, and sort of comparing how if you're in Illinois, and I think the other one might have been, I can't remember what the other one was, another like northern west, but not really west, area, comparing it with Missouri, which I'm guessing southern Missouri, and Arkansas, and showing how instead of kind of like your usual like town square like grid kind of thing, in the South, it's about, these planters and they're sort of taking up the oxygen when it comes into this is how we mark the place, here. Places being named after slaveholders, I guess. And so I just got like a short email, so I don't know exactly how it all works, so y'all don't grill me on this guy's thing. But I'm hoping we can talk more. He's been reading my stuff and seeing how it helps him make his case. But I'm going to try to get him to look into Northern Louisiana and East Texas too, because I could see that rounding out, the study. But anyway, there's people out there asking, these questions. And I love it.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think everybody is now just giving
everybody answered
county names. So thanks. It takes a village, a little help from your friends, that kind of stuff. So maybe we should have a whole program just on chat for everybody. But Thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, and thanks all of y'all for attending.
Yeah, it's been great. Everybody get the book, and please pay attention to when the Six Bridges schedule comes out. Like I said, Kelly's going to be on a panel And if I were smart, I would have looked up who you're on the panel with, but it'll be a great panel.
I actually don't know yet.
Okay. Well,
right.
we'll
they're shuffling around since they switched to virtual, so I think they're working it out.
Okay. Well, we will get that information to everybody, and that should be very interesting. So next month, we have Carla Coleman talking about Oakland Fraternal Cemetery, and it will be virtual again. Maybe at some point we'll get to see each other's faces in real life, but not right now. So I hope to see everybody back here again. As Guy Lancaster says, get vaccinated. Wash your hands, social distance, wear your mask, all that kind of stuff. So thanks, everyone. And thank you again, Kelly. We really appreciate it.